The LG G2 Gallery Edition OLED is definitely a TV you're going to want to keep on your list for 2022. When it comes to LG perfecting their OLED TV, this is the closest that they have gotten. It really is a brilliant TV. Alright, before we get into this in-depth LG G2 review, if you guys could do me a favor and please hit the like button and subscribe button below if you enjoy this type of content. Also, I have the affiliate links for this TV in the description below as well, and if you buy anything using those links, it will help out the channel a lot, so thank you for doing that. And as a reminder, I do buy all of the TVs that I review myself, so with all that out of the way, let's get into this review. Alright, so let's go over the features of the LG G2. It is, of course, an OLED TV, which features the perfect black levels you may have heard about with OLED TVs. It has 4 full bandwidth HDMI 2.1 ports, G-Sync support, it includes a no-gap wall mount, and it features the Brightness Booster Max technology, which is a fancy way of saying that it has a heat dissipation technology inside of it, allowing the TV to maintain higher brightness levels longer and overall be a more efficient TV. That will help reduce the risk of image retention and permanent screen burn-in. The LG A9 Gen 5 processor is the new processor that is implemented in this TV, and it is definitely improved from last year. Some will say that it caught up with Sony's XR, while I'm personally not quite convinced they have gone that far. I will say it has definitely improved since the C1 and G1 of last year. Motion has improved a ton this year as well, so great job with that, LG. And they also integrated an always on smart assistant mode for those of you that really love the smart home control. Now, I can't forget to mention the 5-year panel warranty that is also included here. I think with the wall mount and the 5-year warranty, that is a real good value proposition to have over the C2. So if you are already going to get these things with the C2, it may be worth it to see how much you're spending with everything included with the C2 versus how much you'd be spending just buying the G2 by itself. Alright, let's talk about brightness and then we'll talk about color. So the LG G2 can hit just over 1000 nits, making it LG's brightest OLED TV yet. However, when it comes to noticeable brightness differences between this and say the C2 or Sony's A80J or A80K of this year, you won't see much difference between the two in a lot of content. That is if you're using the most accurate modes. Now, if you want to force the brightness out of this TV, you can definitely do that if you use HDR dynamic tone mapping turned on, and this is enabled by default on all of the HDR modes. So this is something you'll have to toggle off if you're not a fan of it. With the dynamic tone mapping turned on, you will see that it is definitely a bright TV and a lot of HDR content. And this is something I think a lot of people will tend to like, but there is a double-edged sword here with dynamic tone mapping. Sometimes it can have unintentional side effects to what's going on with the picture. For example, there was a scene with the sunset, and if I use dynamic tone mapping on for this particular scene, it would make the sun just completely disappear off of the screen and all I saw was the sky. So you can lose some detail if you use dynamic tone mapping turned on, so keep that in mind. When it comes to brightness and highlights, the G2 can get very bright with the highlights. When I had it next to the S95B in regular content, for the most part, the G2 was trading blows with the S95B for those white highlights, those bright white highlights. Where the G2 will fall short is in the color volume, so the brighter color scenes, that's where you're going to see the advantage with the S95B and the A95K QD OLED TVs, or even an LCD TV. When it comes to color out of the box, the G2 nailed it. Yes, the reds may feel a little oversaturated for some people, but I actually like the way it looked a lot. So comparing it to how the C2 was, I thought it was better than the C2 out of the box for color. Now, I'm not somebody who really cares about color accuracy, but you can just tell something with this TV just feels right. It was really close to what I had experienced with the Sony A90J last year in terms of just getting it right out of the box. You know, the more that I think about it, I do think that the G2 and the A90J, they share a lot of similarities because I'm looking at the A80J and the A90J much like I'm looking at the C2 to the G2 this year. And with the A90J last year, I said if you're getting an A80J and you want to go to an A90J instead, you're only going to see maybe a 10% difference if you're lucky. And I would say the same thing is true for the G2, though when you see that difference, I think it is more significant. But hopefully that comparison will help you guys a little bit when deciding between the C2 and the G2. All right, let's move on to gaming. Of course, you know we gotta talk gaming when we are on this channel. And when it comes to gaming on the G2, I gotta say it's a great HDR gaming TV for the most part. And if you want the most accurate HDR game mode, by design, HGIG should be able to demonstrate that for you most of the time. However, keep in mind, some may feel that this mode is too dim for certain games. And for those people who feel HGIG is too dim for them, I suggest using dynamic tone mapping on with a few tweaks. With dynamic tone mapping turned on, HDR gaming is very bright most of the time for every occasion. However, there are downsides associated with dynamic tone mapping as well, so keep that in mind. My biggest downside for LG's game mode is going to be in SDR and low resolution gaming. When it comes to upscaling low resolution game sources like the Nintendo Switch, I found it to be the worst of the big three manufacturers. And I am also not a fan of how LG locks out peak brightness when SDR games are being detected. If you do a lot of SDR gaming, I suggest looking at a Sony or a Samsung TV as they tend to be the best when it comes to SDR gaming. But keep in mind, that is just my opinion. Alright, let's talk about Game Optimizer because that is a big part of gaming as well. And I think that having something like this is so brilliant. And I love that LG does this as well as Samsung, they do this too. And this is a dedicated game options for your picture modes in game mode. And I think this is really great. To be able to have multiple presets for your games is something that I really want to see more manufacturers do in the future. There's so many different ways to tweak the LG G2 to your liking, and I did a ton of videos on this. So go check that out if you want to deep dive into all those things. All right, so we heard about gaming, we heard about the brightness, we heard about the color. What about the sound? I know not a lot of people care about the sound, but I'm just going to touch on it really quickly. I think that the sound in the G2, it's not terrible, but I will say that I definitely recommend getting a soundbar at least. All right, so let's compare this with other TVs. So for LCD TVs like the QN90B or the X95K, if you are in a pitch black room, get the G2. If you're in a bright room, get the QN90B or the X95K. I still think that the G2 in a bright room wouldn't be something I enjoy over a bright LCD TV like the QN90B or the X95K. And then QD OLED like the S95B. I think the S95B is the better TV overall. And it wouldn't shock me if the A95K was in that category as well. But I wouldn't sacrifice size to get it. So only consider the QD OLED if you are in the 55 or 65 inch size range. Other OLED TVs like the A80K, the C2, I would definitely get the G2 over those OLEDs, especially if you're considering getting your TV mounted or you're buying an extended warranty as well with the mount. So if you're not, and you're considering one of the other OLEDs, I still suggest going a different route, saving some money, and grabbing the C1, the G1, or the A80J if still available, because I don't think there's a huge gap between last year's model and this year's model, with the exception being the G2. Now, if you compare it to the A90J, for example, I do think this one is definitely close, and they are very similar in how they perform overall. And it's going to come down to very niche things within your personal preference. All right, let's talk about watching movies, sports, and TV on this TV. I do think that for the most part, movies is fantastic. There is not too many downsides that I can look for with this TV when watching movies, especially modern 4K HDR movies, with the exception being Dolby Vision. The way that Dolby Vision acts on this TV is very similar to how it would look on a cinema home setting on LG OLEDs of the past. So it does feel like the cinema setting for Dolby Vision is brighter than it's intended to be. So this might make some people who want a more accurate representation a little upset. Maybe that's not what they're looking for with their Dolby Vision. So keep that in mind. I personally don't mind the way that Dolby Vision looks on the G2. I think it looks really great. But there are some times where I can notice that some of the darker scenes maybe should be a little bit darker than they look. That is one thing that you have to keep in mind when it comes to watching TV and movies in Dolby Vision on the G2. When it comes to upscaling older movies, older TV shows, as long as the source is 1080p, I think it looks really great. When we're looking at 720p or maybe even 480p, I tend to think you can get a better upscaling experience from other TV manufacturers. So that's just something you want to keep in mind if upscaling is important to you. I do feel like if upscaling is your number one priority, you should probably look towards a Sony OLED TV. When we're talking about lower resolution sports broadcasts or sports highlights, I did feel like the scoreboards looked a little bit blurry. I didn't feel like the text was as clear as, say, on the Samsung when I had it side by side, and also the Sony A80J. However, when it was side by side next to the C1, it did clean it up better than the C1 did. So again, you can see the improvements from the C1 to the G2 in terms of processing. If there's one area where I want LG to keep focusing on, it's definitely in this area, because I do feel like they fall short of the competition in this area. Alright, so if you felt like this video was helpful to you, please hit the like button and consider subscribing for more content just like this in the near future. I'll have the A95K review later on this year, as well as other side-by-sides with so many different TVs, including that one. If you want to watch a comparison between two of the best TVs on the market, I have the G2 and the S95B going against each other right here. And I also have the G2 versus the A80J, which is very similar to the A80K right next to it. And if it's not up yet, it will be soon. Thank you guys so much for watching. Have a great day, and I will see you in the next one.